welcome back to Migration, Season 2, Episode 11. Have you ever wondered if you or someone you know is somewhere on the autism spectrum? Today we are talking about what is commonly referred to as high-functioning autism and how deeply it relates to my perspective and my direct experience with paranormal states of consciousness. And I'm going to make a bet with you, even if you're 100% confident that you're not anywhere on the autism spectrum, I bet that on some level you're going to really relate to how I explain my personal experience with autism. As I've covered in my books, my articles, and even on this series, I am what is referred to as high-functioning autistic, it's a term that a lot of people don't really care for. And I spent about 16 years as a caseworker for public and private organizations, diagnosing and working with clients who are not neurotypical to ensure that they receive the appropriate assistance and services from the state. Now, autism is a vast spectrum of characteristics, so my experience of being autistic may not be what someone else's is, but we're going to zero in on an idea about autism and Asperger's that is relevant to anyone. So my ultimate take on autism is a perspective that I have never heard explained quite like this before. For me, autism is all about the relationship I carry with symbolism. And that can sound kind of confusing because our relationship with symbolism encompasses most of our interaction with the world. Also, we're a species that has become so steeped in symbolism that we forget we're constantly interacting with stimuli that's only a representation of reality, inherently meaningless patterns that your brain has to translate into meaning. And we forget that in order to truly interact with reality, we have to be paying attention to the only place where reality exists, and that is in the present moment, a place we are spending less and less time. The past and the present is nothing but conceptual. So on today's episode of Migration, we are going to get a little bit autistic, and we're going to realize why that can be a really good thing, especially when it comes to realizing our ultimate connection with non-localized universal consciousness. So get comfortable, smoke them if you got them, and get ready for today's episode of Migration.
Boys' night!
I need help reacting to something.
Aye!
So as I said, autism in my case is all about how I interact with symbolism. But what does that really mean? Oddly enough, lots of people, when they think of symbolism, they think of crude hieroglyphs used by some less advanced civilizations. But of course, when you stop and think about it, you're interacting with symbolism right this very moment. The images and sounds coming from your device are inherently totally meaningless. It's only until your brain translates the light and sound waves pouring from your device into something that makes sense to you that information is transferred. Now, of course, symbolism is not just something found on screens or in the pages of books or in road signs and whatnot. You use symbolism to sort out information in your own head. You think in language and images, so even when you think about yourself and who you are using symbolism. This is why I keep saying that who you actually are, what you really are, and your idea of yourself are literally not the same thing. Your self-image, your ego, is constructed from symbols. So in my own case, as someone on the spectrum, I've always been aware on some level that symbolism is indeed an abstraction. Another way to say that is that I've never really considered my conscious self and my ego, or the personality that I project to the world, to be one and the same. On some level, that has always been obvious to me since I can remember. From my perspective, it's always seemed that one of the major qualities of neurotypical people is that they consider their manufactured identity as being indistinguishable from who they really are. When most people are asked who they are, they'll quickly offer a list of qualities they seem fairly confident about. For me, ever since I acquired language, a personality was more like a tool I used to transmit information to others. And that's what symbolism does. It transfers information. So I always kind of stood apart from symbolism and stories and narratives and media in general. But I get it. That can sound kind of cold. And this is often why autistic people can seem a bit emotionless and just intellectual. We often can come across kind of like Vulcans from Star Trek. But to think of us as not being capable of all the same emotions as everyone else feels is absolutely, totally wrong. For me, I grew up just like any other kid with a full range of emotions and feelings and intuitions, but my emotions were generally a very personal, sort of internal experience for me, and the notion of a personality and a running internal dialogue always seemed foreign to me. It felt like I was being asked to cloak myself in this costume and kind of put on a show for other people where I acted out what was going on inside for me. It seemed fake and fairly unnatural. This is wonderfully illustrated by Growing Up Autie by Nathan McConnell. You should check out his comic. He does a wonderful job of illustrating what the world can look like from an autistic perspective. As a side note, actually, Nathan was one of the first people to kind of help pull me out of the closet on having me talk about my own autism. I was first diagnosed when I was in my 20s, and I told no one, not even my parents, until just a few years ago, and it genuinely wasn't something I was ashamed of. I had suspected I was on the spectrum somehow since I started hearing about the concept of high-functioning autism. I felt it would rather confuse people more than anything else, and given my rather unique experiences with lucid dreaming and out-of-body phenomenon and everything else, experiences that made it hard for people to relate to me, I felt that announcing this might just create another wall between me and other people. Now, since we've become so much better at identifying people with divergent thinking patterns, a lot of the misconceptions about autism are starting to clear up, certainly. But I'd still say the majority of people, they hear the word autism and they think you're somehow mentally ill, or they think you're just a machine that mimics emotions. In general, people seem to get this feeling that who you're presenting yourself to be somehow isn't legitimate, which is personally funny to me because, in a way, autistic people are some of the most direct, honest people I've met, and that alone confuses people who are so used to dealing with the majority of people who are always sort of putting on a show for others. So for most of my life, I really felt no need to announce this to everybody, and in retrospect, I do think it would have added clarity to some of my previous relationships to help them understand how I relate to the world around me, how I don't really identify with narratives and media or even my own ego in the same way that other people do. I'd say that the major difference with my style of functioning is that I could make the choice to play along with this identity game, you might say, but I always remained very aware that this personality I was presenting to the outside world was just a tool to communicate with others, but I never felt like it was who I was. Now, for lower functioning people, as they say, this is more than just an awkward, unnatural feeling. This notion of filtering your awareness through a highly edited context of memory and information and identity that you maintain in this non-stop running internal dialogue is so abstract that it's not really even an option for them. Have you ever just looked at somebody and thought, my God, that person is obviously so fake? To many high-functioning autistics, that's how we kind of see everyone's personality on some level. It all seems like an act. The question is, are you aware it's really just an act? Even as a little kid, I was so confused by kids my own age who took themselves so seriously. They clearly believed, heart and soul, that what they were saying and their self-expression was who they were. And I instinctively knew I was seeing them parroting their parents or siblings or people on television. It clearly wasn't natural, yet what I didn't understand is that they didn't seem to be aware of it. So to summarize all of this, you could say that I never took even my own story terribly seriously. I didn't really identify myself with this running narrative in my head of who I was. It was just a tool I used to sort things out and solve problems and plan for the future and to communicate with other people. As I've explained, our internal dialogue is an incredible tool. It provides us with an amazing advantage over other creatures on this planet, one we've also abused to no end. But I never confused that tool for who I was. So that distance I always felt made it very difficult to communicate and relate with the vast majority of people, and it still does. When I speak to someone, it can take all of my attention to connect with that person and then formulate the right way to clearly communicate what I want to say, and I'm always shocked and confused when they assumed my clear communication was sometimes that they think I was being arrogant or condescending to them. I had to learn that when you don't mix your own emotions and attitude into everything you say, people tend to sprinkle their own attitude in for you. It's one of the main reasons even higher functioning autistic people have such a hard time getting along with others in school or work or anywhere else. It's not because they don't desperately want a connection with other people. And that distance that I experienced with symbolism extended to all the other stories that I was exposed to as well. Whether that story was in a book or on television or someone else was telling me something that happened to them or whatever, I assumed everyone else felt this obvious distance like I did in a way. So when I learned this wasn't the case, it was even more confusing. I remember visiting my great-grandmother with my folks when I was about 8 years old, and my great-grandmother was in an emotional, highly distressed state of mind. She was weeping over the death of this friend of hers named Carol, apparently some good friend of hers who suddenly died. After we got to her house and we learned that this Carol was a character on the soap opera All My Children, I was absolutely dumbfounded. But this was a personality she'd been watching for 20 years, and now Carol was a real person to my great-grandmother, and now, she was dead. As a child, I could not understand what was happening. But Mom, I asked, she knows that none of that is real, right? Again, I'm 8 years old, okay? Mom, she knows that actress isn't really dead, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I've cried during movies. I've cheered for my heroes. I've been frightened for my favorite character's safety and all of that. I adore fiction. My first novel was science fiction, and I go into all of this in much deeper detail in my last book, Migration, which, by the way, you should really read. The links are below. But we're actually wired on a chemical level to connect with other characters around us, even the fake ones, and that should be weird to us, but it's not. Have you ever asked why animals would even evolve to respond to fake stimuli that has no consequence for the creature's survival whatsoever? That our bodies even bother to make and release chemicals like adrenaline to information coming from a screen that we know isn't real is what's really weird. Evolution has not caught up to the tricks our media plays on our nervous system. the part of our nervous system that has knee-jerk reactions to horror movies or that kicks out oxytocin when we see a cute kitten on the internet, is out of our conscious control. It's called the sympathetic nervous system, and you could say it runs its algorithms for survival automatically. It doesn't have time to take into consideration that we consciously know what's happening here isn't actually real. Also, we're social animals out of necessity for our survival. That system can form oxytocin-supported connections with what it deems other members of our pack, and on that basic level, it doesn't understand the difference between that pack member existing in the hut or the house next door to us, or on a page or on a screen. As far as our sympathetic nervous system is concerned, all of those connections we form with characters on some level are very real. You might think of it this way. Which kind of person are you? Let's say two people are watching a horror movie and some character gets their head cut off by some monster, and there's blood gushing everywhere and it looks so damn real. And one person watches that and feels sick and shocked and nauseous to their stomach. They feel they just watched a real murder take place, like they're supposed to. They're stuck in those emotions and therefore somewhat limited by them. They can't see past their own reaction. But then there's the other person who also feels all those same basic emotions, the adrenaline, the fright. Again, this is our sympathetic nervous system firing here. It's out of our control. It's going to somewhat treat it as real. But in the end, this person is delighted with this reaction. These are the horror fans. This is the person who goes, oh my God, the reaction I just had to that was awesome. That was done so well. I want to know how they pulled that effect off. The first person is just caught up in the visceral reaction to it all. Their body tells them it's real. They don't really question it, while the second person is delighted and even made curious by their own reaction. So in one sense, I am that second person watching that horror film who experiences all the same emotions, but I see the entire picture for what it was. I see it for the brilliant feat of magic that it was. I'm amazed how well an author or director or storyteller can play this orchestra of symbolism and know just how my mind and emotions and natural instincts are going to react. And as an autistic, it was hard for me to understand any other perspective beyond that. And it's always, and still is, been odd to me when people try to make these direct point A to point B connections between who a person is and what media they've engaged with. My reactions to what happens on a screen and what my reactions are to the same thing happening in real life aren't even in the same category for me. The kid who shoots up his school, they go and look at what music he's been listening to, what video games he's been playing. It's not that simple. We wish it were. I used to watch the bloodiest horror movies growing up, and I can't tell you how many adults would say, well, only sick people would watch that kind of thing. You must be really sadistic. If you've read the book Migration, you know that for a while there, I jumped down a rabbit hole of the internet. And once I learned how the internet worked, how the dark web worked, I wanted to see everything that I could. So what is the advantage to this perspective, if any at all? How does this relate to lucid dreaming or astral projection or the universal consciousness that I'm constantly pointing back to on this series? Consider that the major obstacle standing in your way of tapping into your true source, into the core of your consciousness, which is ever present, ever awake, is the mask of identity you wear, one you can't seem to separate yourself from. Right this very moment, as you watch this video, you are an awareness peering through what amounts to a series of funnels which are siphoning your attention through layers upon layers of thought, emotion, and identity, your beliefs, your assumptions, your memories, and all your plans for the future. All of that symbolic information creates an orderly context within which your life plays out. And there really is little argument about what I've just said from a neurological or even a psychological perspective. Even if you don't, believe all my assertions that that pure awareness of yours is non-localized, and that once you detach yourself from all those limiting layers of narrative and information, that you can achieve things like astral travel among a whole host of other paranormal phenomena. Yeah, so even if you don't buy that, working to be present with that pure consciousness without identifying with a constant internal commenting on everything will make you happier. It'll make you more at ease and less stressed, more focused, and even physically healthier, period. That's why I say, even if you're the most hardlined atheist, you have no good reason not to meditate. You really are doing yourself an incredible disservice if you're not practicing being in a state where you are observing your thoughts instead of just identifying with them and being ruled by them. So, for a person who's naturally never really took their ego seriously, it's far easier to detach from this massive context of internal information we live our lives through and tap into this enlightenment. In summary, I would say that normal people appear far more domesticated to a constant stream of abstractions in a way that I'll never fully identify with. In fact, doing this speaking part of this show is really very difficult for me because it's not because I'm afraid or I'm shy of the camera or anything like that. If you watch my podcast or my radio interviews closely, you might notice that I'm actually much more at ease and animated when I'm talking to another person. That's because there's a reason to use my ego. I'm using it to communicate to someone else directly, and here I'm not. Right this very moment, I'm totally alone in a closed-off room talking to no one, and I'm very aware of that all the time. I'm staring at an inert camera right now, and that honestly kind of geeks me out because I don't have another personality to interact with, so I'm always kind of fighting an instinct to not express any kind of personality at all. As I keep saying, our life is constantly being framed by this internal story that's playing out in our mind. This happens during the day and even at night in the form of our dreams. Personally, since I had a natural distance from all of my internal contexts, I think it was just natural for me to kind of look at even my dreams while they were playing out and go, wait a minute, none of this is real either. And then when I realized I was conscious while I was dreaming, I started playing around with what happens to consciousness when it is completely unbound to the limiting cage that a story creates for us. It's why I say in my books and my articles that in many ways, lucid dreaming can come far more naturally to autistics, even to the point where they have a hard time staying asleep. In more extreme cases, this can actually become quite a problem. So that's why I say the world could use a little bit more autism right now. We need to wake up to all of the narratives that are taking place on the internet and in our news, on social media, in our entertainment. And that doesn't mean questioning one narrative and then blindly defending another one. People do that all the time. They question the mainstream narrative they've been fed and then they declare themselves open-minded while not throwing the same criticism to the new narrative they've adopted, where we are seeing this all the time. That is all we're going to cover on this topic today. Again, if this discussion fascinates you and you want to go even deeper, please really go check out my last book, Migration. It's available on Kindle and in paperback for a pretty decent price. There are, again, links below in the description, so go check that out. And if you want to support this channel in some way, I'm still brand new around here. I don't get paid to do this, but there are things you can do that benefit both of us. Go check out my art. Go check out my books. All of my artwork is on prints, stuff like that. So that always helps, and I feel better about that because then it's not just like a Patreon sort of thing where you're just sort of handing money off to me. There's a real exchange. You will get some awesome product in exchange. So if you want to support this channel, don't just subscribe and like, which definitely do those things, but go take a look at some of my products out there. Again, all of the links, I will put that below in the description. So again, thank you so much for hanging out and watching. I appreciate that, and until next time, take care. Thanks. And welcome back to Migration Season 2, Episode 11. I remembered this time. But I didn't remember my fucking lines. Cool.